Imagine for a moment that the great emancipator, the man who preserved the Union and abolished slavery, led a double life. By day, he was the 16th President of the United States, but by night, he wielded silver axes and hunted the undead. This is the provocative legend behind Abraham Lincoln, Vampire Hunter, a story that has captured imaginations through novels, films, and folklore-inspired reinterpretations. But what's the truth behind this outlandish idea? Is there any real history buried beneath the Gothic horror? Or is it purely modern mythmaking? In today's episode, we're going to peel back the layers of this strange legend. We'll explore how this myth emerged, examine the narrative of Lincoln the Vampire Slayer in detail, and look at how it cleverly remixes American history to comment on slavery, violence, and morality. By the end, you'll see how this tale ain't just about monsters in the shadows, it's about the real horrors of history, and why we use fantasy to make sense of them. Let's start at the beginning. There is no historical evidence known whatsoever that Abraham Lincoln ever hunted vampires. The entire premise is a work of alternate history fiction. It was popularized in 2010 by Seth Grahame-Smith's novel Abraham Lincoln, Vampire Hunter, which reimagines the president's life as secretly shaped by a war against the undead. That novel was quickly adapted into a 2012 action horror film. The story blends genuine 19th century American history with a dark, supernatural conspiracy, the idea that vampires built their wealth and power on the institution of slavery. But why did this idea catch on? Partly, it's because Abraham Lincoln is already a larger-than-life figure. His legacy as the president who preserved the Union and ended slavery is so grand that he feels mythic even without supernatural trappings. Secondly, Americans have a long tradition of remixing their own history through folklore, conspiracy theories, horror stories, and pop culture. Turning Lincoln into a vampire hunter is an extreme, stylized way to talk about moral conflict, the violence of slavery, and the idea of evil hiding in plain sight. In other words, while the vampire hunter legend is completely fictional, it offers a twisted but pointed metaphor about the real bloodshed of the American Civil War. Now let's dive into the story itself. In this fictional retelling, Abraham Lincoln's childhood is marked by tragedy. His mother dies of a mysterious illness that turns out to be no ordinary sickness. It is the work of a vampire named Jack Bart, a cruel slaver who feeds on the blood of the enslaved. When Lincoln learns the truth about his mother's death, he swears vengeance, but his first attempt at revenge nearly kills him. He's saved by a man, Henry Sturgis, who reveals the terrifying truth. Vampires are real, they're organized, and they've built empires in the shadows of human civilization. Henry offers to train Lincoln as a vampire hunter. But there's a catch. Henry himself is a vampire Ione who can no longer kill his own kind. He needs a human ally to do what he cannot. This is one of the most intriguing elements of the legend. Henry's character embodies moral ambiguity. He's a monster who regrets what he is, and who chooses to fight against his own kind by proxy. So Lincoln learns to hunt. He trains to wield silver weapons, because silver burns vampires like acid. He also learns the importance of strategy, stealth, and emotional distance. Henry warns him, don't form attachments, don't let anyone close. But of course, that's not who Lincoln is. As he grows into adulthood, Lincoln lives a double life. By day, he's an ambitious lawyer and budding politician. By night, he stalks the undead. He tracks down and eliminates vampires hiding among slave owners, corrupt businessmen, and the wealthy elite. The story draws a deliberate connection between slavery and vampirism. The vampires feed on the enslaved, turning the institution of slavery into a literal source of blood and power. This is one of the central metaphors of the legend, Vampires aren't just supernatural predators, they're symbols of systemic exploitation. By fighting them, Lincoln isn't just battling monsters. He's battling the moral rot at the heart of America. Despite Henry's warnings, Lincoln falls in love with Mary Todd. He marries her, determined to have a normal life even as he hunts in secret. Meanwhile, the vampire empire is not idle. They notice Lincoln's interference. The vampire patriarch, Adam, sees the threat he poses. Adam is ancient, powerful, and utterly ruthless. In one pivotal episode, Adam kidnaps Lincoln's friend Will Johnson, hoping to lure Lincoln into a trap. Adam offers Lincoln a deal: join the vampires and share their power. Rule over humans instead of fighting for them. But Lincoln refuses. Lincoln's private war with the undead takes on a new dimension as the nation itself begins to fracture. The 1850s see rising tensions over slavery, with the country tearing at the seams over the question of human bondage. In the legend, this isn't merely a political or moral issue. It's portrayed as part of the vampires' grand strategy. The vampires see the United States as a prime feeding ground. Slavery ensures a steady supply of disposable humans, while political division weakens the country's ability to resist. In the novel and film versions of the myth, there's even the notion that vampires are deliberately stoking secession to create chaos. Lincoln, now an experienced vampire hunter, realizes that the Civil War is not just a conflict between North and South. It's a war for the soul of humanity. Bears. If the Confederacy wins, the vampire aristocracy will have free reign. This is where the legend becomes a dramatic metaphor. The real American Civil War was the bloodiest conflict in U.S. history, fought over the moral abomination of slavery. By reimagining the slave-owning elite as literal vampires, the story lays bare the horror of treating humans as property and as expendable. Lincoln's election as president is a declaration of open war against the vampires. They see him as their greatest threat, someone who can rally humanity to end their blood-fed empire. As president, Lincoln is torn between two fronts. Publicly, he's a war leader responsible for saving the Union. Privately, he's waging a shadow war against supernatural predators. In this fictional version of history, the Emancipation Proclamation is more than a moral stand, it's a tactical move. By freeing the enslaved, Lincoln cuts off the vampire's primary food supply. This is one of the more striking reinterpretations in the myth. It reframes the proclamation just as a political or humanitarian act, but as a blow against a hidden evil. Yet Lincoln is no superhero. He's weary, burdened, and morally conflicted. He knows that thousands will die in battle. He questions whether he's damned himself by fighting monsters with monstrous methods. His relationship with Henry Sturgis also grows strained. Henry trained Lincoln to hunt vampires, but he withheld truths. For example, Henry admits he can't be cursed to wander the earth, unable to end his own existence. He also reveals that there are vampires in the North as well, profiting from industry and finance. Lincoln realizes there is no simple moral clarity. Vampirism, like slavery, is systemic. It's everywhere. But he also refuses to give up. The Civil War rages on. In the legend, many of the real historical battles have a supernatural subtext. Gettysburg, for instance, is depicted as a turning point not only for the Union Army, but for humanity's survival. In the myth, Confederate forces are reinforced by vampires. Their speed, strength, and ability to terrorize human soldiers threaten to make the South unbeatable. Lincoln has to devise new weapon silver-tipped ammunition. For example, even the odds. He coordinates with trusted allies like Will Johnson, who becomes a kind of Van Helsing figure, helping smuggle silver arms and train soldiers to resist the undead. But the war takes a personal toll. In one of the story's most emotional moments, Lincoln's young son Willie dies. Historically, Willie Lincoln died of illness in the White House in 1862. In the Vampire Hunter version, the cause is even darker. Vampires poison him, a targeted assassination meant to break Lincoln's spirit. He's devastated, consumed by grief, and tempted to abandon everything. But he realizes that surrender would doom countless others to the same fate. His pain becomes fuel for his resolve. As the war draws to its bloody conclusion, Lincoln faces his greatest enemy, Adam, the ancient vampire patriarch, who sees the Confederacy as his ticket to global dominance. Their final battle is the symbolic as well as literal. Lincoln fights not just for the Union, but for the very idea that humans deserve to be free from predation, bit slavery or vampirism. He defeats Adam using his silver axe, the weapon that has defined his second life as a slayer. But victory comes at a price. The story doesn't rewrite Lincoln's assassination out of history, it gives it a new layer. John Wilkes Booth is not merely a Confederate sympathizer, but a vampire collaborator. The assassination at Ford's Theater is the vampire's last revenge. In this telling, Lincoln knows he's doomed. He accepts it. His death becomes a final act of sacrifice. Henry Sturgis, watching from the shadows, survives into the modern age. He continues hunting, haunted by the loss of the best human ally he ever had. The ending is tragic, heroic, and suitably gothic. Now that we've covered the events of this vampire hunter legend, let's talk about the big idea at its heart, turning the American slave system into a literal vampiric conspiracy is not just a pulpy gimmick. It's a stark metaphor. Slavery was, in a real and horrifying sense, a system of human predation. The enslaved were treated as property, their labor and lives consumed for profit. In Abraham Lincoln, Vampire Hunter, the vampires represent the ultimate expression of that exploitation. They feed on humans, literally draining their life, while defending an economic order built on bondage. By imagining slaveholders as vampires, the story makes the moral horror of slavery impossible to sanitize. There's no states' rights dodge here. The Confederacy in the legend is openly monstrous. This is why the metaphor has power even if it's fantastical. It channels the real moral revulsion that drove Lincoln and many abolitionists. Slavery wasn't just an economic question or a way of life to be politely debated. It was a crime against humanity. The vampire myth gives that reality teeth. It also acknowledges something uncomfortable. The North was not free of complicity. In the legend, there are vampires in northern banks and factories. They profit in more subtle ways. This adds moral complexity, reminding us that systemic evil can be pervasive, not confined to one region. It's worth pausing to contrast the legend with the real Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln didn't start as a radical abolitionist. Early in his career, he opposed slavery's expansion, but did not call for its immediate abolition in the South. He argued against the spread of slavery into new territories, while reassuring Southerners that he wouldn't interfere where it already existed. But the Civil War changed him. By 1862, faced with a bloody stalemate, Lincoln recognized that ending slavery was both a moral imperative and a military necessity. The Emancipation Proclamation was revolutionary, declaring freedom for enslaved people in rebelling states. It transformed the war's purpose from merely preserving the Union to destroying slavery itself. Lincoln's evolution was marked by tragedy and loss. He mourned the cost in lives and felt the weight of responsibility. Even without the supernatural framing, he was fighting a kind of monstrous system. This is one reason the vampire hunter legend resonates. It's an exaggerated, but thematically faithful way of seeing Lincoln as a man who recognized evil and chose to fight it, even at terrible personal cost. Abraham Lincoln, Vampire Hunter, isn't the only story to use horror as social commentary. This tradition runs deep. Gothic and horror fiction have long been tools to explore taboo or terrifying aspects of society. Mary Shelley's Frankenstein wrestled with scientific hubris and responsibility. Bram Stoker's Dracula embodied fears of foreign contagion and predatory sexuality. More recently, works like Jordan Peele's Get Out use horror to dissect racism in modern America. By using monsters to embody social evils, horror makes abstract moral questions visceral. It lets audiences confront fear and disgust in ways that straightforward drama often can't. Abraham Lincoln, Vampire Hunter leans heavily into this tradition. Its premise is deliberately outrageous, turning the great emancipator into a monster slayer, but it's not entirely cynical. It's using the conventions of pulp horror to force us to see slavery not only as a distant, dry topic from textbooks, but as something horrific. And while it's over the top, it's also unflinching about depicting the Confederacy as an empire of predation. It refuses to romanticize the Old South, instead showing it as a system built on blood. So why does this legend stick with us? Partly because it's a wild mashup of history and horror with axe fights on top of trains, but also because it taps into a deeper cultural need to see moral clarity in history. We want heroes who don't compromise with evil. The real Lincoln was pragmatic and conflicted, but he also recognized that slavery had to die for the Union to live. The vampire hunter myth gives that truth a heightened, cinematic form. It lets us process the real horror of America's past by making it literal, then watching our hero fight it with everything he has. And it acknowledges that evil doesn't die easily. It suggests that even if you win the war, there will always be monsters lurking in the dark. In the end, Abraham Lincoln, Vampire Hunter, is pulp fiction with surprising thematic bite. By imagining America's most iconic president as a slayer of literal vampires, it forces us to confront the monstrous reality of slavery in a fresh way. It's not real history, but it's a powerful kind of mythmaking. Lincoln really did fight to save the Union and end an evil system. The legend just gives him an axe and an immortal nemesis to make that struggle unmistakably clear, and in its own lurid, gothic way, it honors the truth that freedom is always worth the fight. The legend of Abraham Lincoln, Vampire Hunter, didn't stop at the page. In 2010, Seth Grahame-Smith's novel became a surprise bestseller. It stood out from the wave of mashup fiction by treating its absurd premise with absolute sincerity. There were no winks at the camera in the book's tone. Lincoln's diaries, political speeches, and personal tragedies were all reimagined as part of his secret war on vampires. Hollywood took notice. By 2012, the novel was adapted into a major studio film, directed by Timur Bekmambetov and produced by Tim Burton. That choice of director was telling. Bekmambetov was known for kinetic, stylized action in movies like Wanted, which featured gravity-defying stunts and slow-motion violence. The film leaned hard into visual spectacle. Lincoln fights vampires on horseback and atop speeding trains. The action is drenched in CGI blood and improbable physics. Historical moments, like the Gettysburg Address, are reframed as rallying cries against vampiric conspiracies. The movie also tried to keep some of the novel's gravity. It depicted slavery as the vampire's food supply, showing enslaved people in chains ready for slaughter. But it balanced this grim metaphor with high-octane set pieces, hoping to entertain while unsettling. That combination made for a strange but memorable experience, part horror film, part superhero origin story, part revisionist history lesson. Adapting this kind of concept isn't easy. The film had to walk a tightrope. It needed to be serious enough to make the metaphor land, but entertaining enough to justify its ridiculous title. That tonal balance is hard to maintain. Some viewers loved the unapologetic weirdness. They enjoyed seeing Lincoln, usually portrayed as solemn and dignified, swinging an axe in slow motion as vampire heads flew. For them, it was a refreshing, wild genre remix of a history lesson they thought they knew. Others found the movie awkward. Critics noted that it sometimes felt like two different films fighting each other. One a pulpy, grindhouse-style monster flick, the other a solemn alternate history drama about the real horror of slavery. By veering between these modes, the film arguably undercut its own metaphor. The spectacle could make the real historical violence feel less weighty, even exploitative. Reviews were mixed to negative overall, with many praising the imaginative premise but criticizing the execution. Still, it developed a cult following precisely because it dared to be so strange. Few movies take such big, bizarre swings with American history. Interestingly, the novel itself avoided some of those tonal clashes. In prose, Grahame-Smith could maintain a deadpan seriousness throughout. He used the format of a biography, with historical documents, journal entries, and footnotes that mimicked real scholarship even as they described vampire hunts. This faux academic style let readers buy into the absurd premise more easily. It also gave more space to explore Lincoln's psychology and moral struggle. In the book, Lincoln is haunted by personal tragedy: his mother killed by vampires, his son lost to illness. These moments resonate because they parallel the real Lincoln's genuine grief and loss. By treating the supernatural elements with total sincerity, the novel arguably delivered its metaphor more effectively. Readers could reflect on the real monstrosity of slavery without being distracted by CGI fight choreography. For some fans, the book remains the definitive version of the legend, offering a sharper critique wrapped in Gothic horror. Abraham Lincoln, Vampire Hunter isn't the only work to use horror to reframe history. Inglourious Bastards turned World War II into a revenge fantasy. Pride and Prejudice and Zombies, also from Seth Grahame Smith, mashed classic literature with undead apocalypse. Even the Underground Railroad, Barry Jenkins's 2021 TV adaptation of Colson Whitehead's novel, introduced fantastical elements to highlight real historical horrors. These stories use genre tropes: vampires, zombies, alternate timeliness, not to trivialize history, but to make us look at it differently. Horror, in particular, is well suited to this. It literalizes fear and evil. When you turn slave holders into vampires, you're not making them less, really underscoring the inhuman cruelty of their actions. Of course, this approach has limits. It can feel tasteless if done carelessly, or if spectacle overwhelms meaning. But when it works, it helps audiences confront historical injustices with fresh urgency. Ultimately, the legend of Abraham Lincoln as a vampire hunter isn't about rewriting history, it's about mythmaking. We already mythologize Lincoln as the great emancipator, the savior of the Union. This legend pushes that to supernatural extremes, turning moral struggle into literal combat with monsters. It's pulpy, it's bizarre, but it's also a reminder that the fight against evil is real even if the vampires aren't. By embracing this dark, fantastical metaphor, the story invites us to reckon with America's past in all its horror and to ask what monsters still lurk in our own time. Abraham Lincoln was many things: lawyer, president, wartime commander, slave freer. He was not a vampire hunter, but the legend persists because it says something true. That he saw a terrible evil in his time and chose to fight it. True history doesn't need monsters to be terrifying, but sometimes turning evil into something with fangs and claws helps us see it more clearly. And in the fight for freedom, maybe that's a story worth telling. Thanks for listening, and please subscribe and like Tales Mythology to stay tuned for future episodes.